been watching The Chosen lately, and they haven't. I don't think that they've made it to this part of Scripture yet, but I don't think that they have because I haven't watched all of it. But the thing about it is that I can't wait to find out how they handle Peter in this part right here, because they've been handling Peter like lots of ways. Like I'm assuming that a lot of people that would be interested in watching it would know that if I said at the beginning of it, they really set Peter up to be in a deep, deep hole at the beginning of this before, he finally gets to the point where he's on his knees before Jesus. So I would just love to see how they're going to handle this. And also I would love to see how you're going to handle it, because, I wouldn't be doing this podcast probably if it wasn't for you. I'd probably still be like flitting around various churches, and if it wasn't for a perspective, kind of a unique perspective that you bring to this, I wouldn't be doing it. So I always love doing these things. So
all right,
you needed a compliment.
Thank you. Now I'm
not that you
feeling all puffy, and it'll be great. Yeah.
Not that you don't deserve one.
And so those listening to the podcast, who are members of Trinity, they will definitely make it their project to make sure that I don't feel too puffy. Thanks.
That's the job of a congregation.
Thanks a lot. Okay. Well, anyhow, so I mentioned it before, but the gospel lessons, of course, during this year, or this lectionary year, they're from Matthew. And so now we are in Matthew 14, and last Sunday's gospel reading involved the feeding of the 5,000. And so now the feeding of the 5,000 is over, and the disciples have picked up the baskets of broken fragments of fish and of bread. And so it's time now to call it a night, because it was already kind of getting late in the day. Mm-hmm. And so now they're in a remote place. And that's the setting here, because, it's kind of like, it's time for people to go home. So including the disciples, they don't need to hang out there so late on this remote hill with Jesus. So anyway, would you open yours Bible to Matthew 14, and we'll start at verse 22. And we might as well read the whole thing and then come back to different parts. So we'll read from 22 through the end of 33.
Through the end of 33? Okay.
Yeah.
So beginning with 22, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. And later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. And shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
All right, thank you. So there's the text from Matthew, and I don't know how many. I'm preaching on it this Sunday, but I don't know. There's other texts you could preach on for this Sunday, but this is a good text. I certainly remember preaching on it before, and well, you got to figure out what you're going to do with it. And here's what I mean is that, and there's some contention about what are allowable. I just shouldn't say allowable. Lots of things, there's not like a sermon police running around, but
are you sure?
Well, I don't
Sometimes there
know.
is.
So here's what it'll do in a lot of churches. The minister is going to, in a sense, I won't say it's the right word isn't allegorize it, but because you can take this as relaying historical data, things that happened, real events, and still say, well, but for our sermon purposes, what I need to do is I need to make this personal to you, right? So generally what happens is that the storms and the winds and the waves that are battering you and buffeting you around, these are the troubles of life. These are the things that happen in daily life, or maybe they'll restrict it to the things that happen on account of being a Christian. But either way, it's like you're going through all kinds of real difficulties and well, who comes out to you walking on the water and, who obviously, in the midst of all the turmoil, in the midst of your life's disasters, he comes to you through all these things and then by simply his presence, he calms the waves. He calms it down. He makes the wind die down. And this is the idea that, well, because Jesus is with you in the boat, that he's going to be able to sort out kind of the things in life that otherwise might knock you down and you'd never get up on your own. But Jesus is there. And that's okay. And that will be how or something like that will be how they'll approach the sermon. And well, you can see immediately that there's some reasons why that's attractive, because people do have turmoils in their own personal lives, and they are going through different, sometimes extended rough patches where things are just going from bad to worse, it seems. And well, that's when they need they're calling out on Jesus, and that it is a comfort to think about him coming to me in my distress and making making life work again, whatever that's going to look like going forward. And for all the and I don't know if I've ever preached on it exactly that way, but I mean, I know that it is not uncommon to hear it that way. So then you have another viewpoint, and this has been I haven't gone over his work extensively, but there's a seminary professor, or now he's still, I believe, at the St. Louis Seminary, and he wrote the Concordia commentary. So this is Dr. Gibbs on Matthew, and so well. He is very wary of using this text for that kind of sermon. And he's got his good reasons. For one thing, he doesn't want people to lose track of the idea that this really does have something that happened to Jesus. It's a narrative, that, well, it's kind of an important narrative. It shows up in more than one gospel account. But besides that, he would have us recognize that it's not exactly a proof, although you can think of it like a proof. It demonstrates who Jesus is by the command he has over these natural elements, the winds, the waves, the things that are going on. But he is above these and he can control them. And this is exactly why, if you also pay attention to the Old Testament lesson on this coming Sunday, you can see that the people who put together the lectionary thought the same thing, that the main point is not how Jesus comforts you in the middle of life's storms. The main point is Jesus, the one who is in control of and in command of the natural elements, that this is a demonstration of divine power and sovereign, ability to decree. And that's why they paired it with a reading from Job, where God is making the argument, in this dialogue with Job, that basically says, well, where were you? And then he goes on into all these different things when, quite extensively, who's, tell me if you know. He uses that kind of language all the time about where and under what circumstances, the seas were set, like where their shoreline would be, how far they can go and no further. And the different things that we would call, well, we would say, well, that's poetic language. And probably, yeah, that's the best way to think about it, because we don't really think that there are storerooms in heaven, storehouses of hail and things like that. But certainly the language there is to tell Job and the reader that the only one, and really the one who is in control of all these things, is God. He made these natural elements, and he still exercises control over them, and they do his bidding. It's like, if he wants it to be a bad storm come through, that's his prerogative. But if he wants things to settle down and calm down, some nice weather for a change, well, he can make that happen. And that's why the lectionary paired Matthew 14 and this lection with that section from Job, because it's showing, well, God's in control of weather and the oceans and the bodies of water and the other things that are going on. And Jesus is too.
Yeah.
Right?
Where in Job, it says something to the effect of God speaks from the storm. Right?
Well, that's not the part that I was just referring to. I don't have it. Well, I actually do have it. I could look at it right now. I could tell you where the Old Testament reading is. It's from Job 38. And he says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? He's sort of sarcastically, surely you know, because, Job, you're in a position to question me, and so surely you must know all this stuff. He talks about, have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Well, literally to Jesus, that's for sure, because he passed through these, and then he, you can think about the harrowing of Hades, there where he's the gates of death and deep darkness don't mean anything now because he's had victory over them. But the whole idea is that Jesus is showing his power, his control in Matthew 14, and it's the same kind of way that God is asserting his complete control in Job 38. And the people who put together the lectionary said, we should put these two together for this particular Sunday. The one will inform the other. That's the idea, is you want the two passages to sort of inform each other. And I think that Dr. Gibbs would have no problem with looking at it that way, that is in fact more why Matthew is making sure to tell the story and get these details right. Okay, so I think that is good. I think that's look at me. You're agreeing with somebody. I'm agreeing with somebody who's got an earned doctorate, and I don't. But okay, so but I'm right in there. I'm going to give my spin anyway. Maybe he'll forgive this kind of thinking because I don't like. I see the point about making it all the application of you and your storms in life. Okay, and Jesus coming to you in the midst of all that. It's kind of it's a useful application because it reaches into where people live. But here's my biggest problem, I guess you could say my biggest criticism of that kind of sermon, that kind of viewpoint, is while it is true individually, we do have these different storms in life, if you want to call it that, or at least difficulties that we're trying to overcome. They seem like they're going to swamp us instead of the other way around. But and it is true that Jesus will come and he will come to our aid in a very real way. But the thing about projecting that into Matthew's gospel is that Matthew is not really, he wants the individual disciple to learn and to grow in faith because of what he's recording. But it's not really written to, you as the individual believer, and this is what you got going on. Individualism as a thing is not that prevalent in the New Testament. So this idea that everything is all up, you got to drill it down to me, myself, and I. What am I going through? My sin, my heart, my faith, my conversion, my distress. And you can argue, well, yeah, but God cares about you as an individual. He does. And yet this New Testament isn't really looking at these things from the way a Western American 21st century person would, where the individual is kind of supreme. That's not how the ancients looked at things. So I just kind of, that's my criticism, is I'm suspicious that it is a way too modern way of looking at individuals and individualism and what, my individual walk of discipleship, as though Matthew is trying to, give me that kind of encouragement for my life, my own individual life right now. Even if the application sort of fits, it's maybe not what he meant. And I agree that certainly there's the idea that it shows that Jesus has a control over things that normal human beings don't. We don't control weather patterns and sea conditions and things like that. So there is that, but is there something else? And I started, for me, what became an insight catalyst was, of course, two things that became catalysts. One of them is that they're freaking out. They're terrified. They're saying it's a ghost. And Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I." So it's the fact that this is really me out here with you, even though you're in the boat and I'm not in the boat. Now let's leave the boat aside for a second. The boat, it represents safety. It represents something in the middle of, this body of water. And in this case, it's Lake Galilee, but the Mediterranean Sea and the ocean and water in general evokes a certain response in ancient Jewish minds, because it's not like the solid ground, and it's not like, Mount Zion, something that's solid and permanent and immovable. You get these images of a watery chaos, even if it's a smaller body of water. Okay, but that's not the only thing. The other thing, so take heart, because I am there with you through this. Okay, with you, like with you all, with you, my disciples. Yeah, I'm with you individually in a sense, because you're all there and I'm with you. But the idea is, that you can be plural. And it is I. So don't be afraid. Don't freak out. And Peter is the one who answers him. He says, "Well, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you on the water," right? And Jesus says, "Okay, come on." And that's when Peter begins coming out and walking on the water. Now, you can say he doesn't make it all that far. Okay, but he makes it far enough that when he starts sinking, Jesus at least can reach out his hand and grab him. So he did something that was quite astonishing, right? That's the whole point. So I started asking myself, could that fact that Jesus has met them. He's met not just Peter, but he's met them out in the water, out in the wild, so to speak, away from the safety of the boat. Does that represent something? Because I don't have a problem having some kind of symbolic representation going on along with a historical narrative. So I think, well, okay, so he's out there in the watery wild, and it's a rough place, and the disciples, his disciples, they're gathered in this boat. And well, what's that like? So I start kind of thinking, well, that's, sometimes the church is looked at as kind of a ship, a boat, a place, there's an ark, basically. And then so if the church is the ship or the boat or the ark out there in the midst of a watery, wilderness, then that could maybe represent the world. And there is something chaotic about the world. And we're out there and we're fighting to keep going, but the world is kind of blowing back against us. That sort of fits. But Jesus comes to us, but he is out in the world. He's like, people think about, well, we're going to bring Jesus to the world. Jesus is kind of already out there. He's out there in the midst of what's going on, crazy though it is. He's there. He's not shocked by it, and he's not sinking, nor is he trying to do something to get out of the situation. He's completely at home there. And so then this is the interesting part, is that Peter then, is saying, well, if it's you, if this is all real, then have me come to you. So he said, come on. Because actually, all the disciples, Peter's actually showing something good here. Get out of the boat, even though the boat represents safety and the boat is necessary, but come out to Jesus. Because will Jesus be in the boat with you? Well, yeah, eventually. Yeah, he's coming, he's making his way, but you can go out to meet him out in the wild. You might say now the water is like a mission field or the world, and don't lose your nerve, right? And don't lose your faith. And in fact, that's what happens, is that he starts looking around, that this is a rough environment. And Jesus says, well, why did you of little faith? Why did you doubt? Because, you're coming out to meet me, and we're out here, we're meeting each other out in the water, or out on the water. And that's quite an amazing thing. And I think that instead of looking at this as my problems in life, maybe we should look at this as almost a mission text. Like, the church could do a little more work outside of the boat. Jesus is there. And yeah, we've always got the boat to come back to. The church is someplace where we do find safety and security. But Jesus is out there in the water, and he bids us come. And why doubt? Why not believe that Jesus is out there for a reason, and we should be out there with him? So, is it a great analogy? I don't know. Maybe not. But it's the best I've got right now, because it takes into account who the disciples are as a group and who we are as a group. And it's not just about me and my individual problems, because that sounds that addressing me and my individual problems, that sounds kind of therapeutic, and maybe not really what Matthew would be on to. So there's an idea of how to look at this as an encouragement for the church, for the disciples to be more bold. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, to be bold. See, that's actually a good point, because there's another time when there's a boat that's involved, and Jesus is asleep, and there's a storm, right? And Jesus is like, it's almost like it's a model of again, why did you doubt? I got up and the storm stopped.
Yeah.
That's He's basically telling us that, yeah, he's got this and he's got us. Thanks for listening to Radical Grace Radio today, and may God bless you all.